example from any hospital he's found, and I get it all the time, is a woman who floated out of her body, out of the bed, made a tour of the outside of the hospital,
saw the shoe,
noticed that there was a running shoe on one of the windowsills, woke up, reported it to a nurse, whose name we've never been told, and who went and looked, and there was the shoe. Now, if that doesn't prove it, I don't know what does. I could hardly be more reassured if I'd been told that it was able to reunite it with its missing pair. NDE is bullshit. It doesn't count. It's not coming back from the dead, nor is it an account of what happens to you when you're gone. It's what can happen to you with the help of life-preserving scientific medicine while you are still alive. Finito la commedia.
I would just add one thing. This kind of question is still scientifically tractable. Reasonably serious people have tried to study the near-death experience. And this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociating from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable, and so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, "I saw this weird digital readout, above your cabinets, and it was 35721." That would be very interesting. Now, no one, to my knowledge, has done that. But if people, this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines, but again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
It's about as good
as
the people...
It's testable, and there's no data there.
But people are just as convinced that they used in past lives to be... It always tends to be a princess, you notice. Or a charioteer, or something of this sort. It's as real to them as the rest of their pathetic lives are. But it's subjective, and it's wish fulfilling, and it doesn't count. I'm actually a bit amazed we haven't got to wish fulfillment yet. Could I say a word about
Sure.
that? I mean, Freud, in his Future of an Illusion, says that the connection between our desires and our beliefs in the case of the afterlife is so obvious. It's mankind's oldest and most strong dread. Maybe we could duck the fate that appears to be in store for us. That it's unlike any belief that Sam and I can offer you. Maybe all kinds of discrepancies between scientific views. We cannot promise you things of this kind, as religion always has to people. It doesn't make us morally superior, but it does mean, and we're not particularly happy with what we propose, which is overwhelmingly likely that annihilation and extinction await us. It's just that the overwhelming weight of evidence seems that way. Now, again, to quote Dinesh, he said to me once, "Well, I can see why people want heaven for themselves, and that's wish-fulfilling, and eternal life, even though I think that's a horrible idea myself, but still. But why do they want hell? Why would a wish fulfiller invent the inferno?" Well, I think that's pretty obvious. It's for other people to go to. A very old rhyme among English Calvinists was, "We are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crammed." In fact, in the work of many early church fathers, I'm so glad to find, by the way, that anything written in the first century by religious people doesn't count. And I wish that more ministers of religion would make that concession. But Tertullian and many other Christian fathers thought that one of the pleasures of heaven, because it's always been rather hard to describe them, you ever noticed that? Eating foie gras to the sound of trumpets was the Reverend Sidney Smith's best shot. We know what the Muslims think for men. Apparently for women, do you know what they get? They get their husbands back.
Is that heaven?
Nothing man-made about that, right? But the church, at least the Christian church fathers, said no. One of the pleasures of paradise is surveying and relishing the torments of the damned. When we talk about wish fulfillment, we're talking about the very unpleasant primate species to which we belong and the self-interested fantasies that it will continue to generate. One of which is religion.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Brad.
two things to say here. The first, I need to confess to the audience. My mother, the atheist, the Freudian psychoanalyst atheist, wants me to tell you that she's rooting for you guys. And the two can play at that kind of clever and cute trick. So you've confessed that the idea of an afterlife is a hideous idea. Well, of course, there's a wish fulfillment involved in hoping that we're not accountable and that at the end it's all over. So one can pathologize the other viewpoint, but it's unworthy of you. It seems to me that the test in Jewish tradition is not another person's theology, but their behavior. And that unethical behavior is to be condemned, even if it comes from a good atheist, just as it is to be condemned by someone who claims to cloak it in religious rhetoric. So here's the last religious thing I want to say. At the very core of traditional Judaism is the notion of bechira, of choice, which means no miracle is so unambiguous that it can't be explained away as secular, and no miracle is so overwhelming that you have to accept it. So you have a perfect example of that. We have this data that suggests that the mind has a far greater range than we have previously admitted that it has. My autistic son is capable of hearing through walls. He'll listen in school to 2 classrooms down, and accurately, we've report what that teacher was saying when his teacher was too boring to listen to. Don't we all wish our brains could do that? And so the expanse of the mind is far beyond what we have described it as being capable of being. So one can look at this data and say, this looks to me like intimations that we do in some key and important way have consciousness that is mediated through our minds but is not limited to our brains. And then it's equally plausible to say, until you're dead, you have no business talking about it. It does feel to me that the irrelevant aspect of this, and the Freudian in me looks at the animus here and says that's what needs to be accounted for, is that for many of us, hope in an afterlife grounds us and gives us direction. And the notion that my grandmother and I are not eternally separate is a source of great and abiding comfort to me.
Do you believe you'll see her?
If by see you want me to walk into something literal
Well, you just
again,
said you're not eternally separate. I don't know what you mean.
I'm using a metaphor because I think we are packets of energy. Look, I get that from physics as well. We are packets of energy, and I don't think those packets of energy are necessarily limited to our body. And the last thing I have to say, just to clear my reputation here, at no point did I say that first century literature was irrelevant. What I said is it's not meant to be taken literally.
I want to piggyback on what Brad said.
That's not what it said.
We've gone around this several times. Almost every time that Christopher and I have debated, which is now several times, I've made this same point, but obviously to no effect. So either the point is not good or the point is not good. But I want to make it anyway. Listen, when someone explains their own beliefs by reason and explains your belief by psychology, you actually don't have to listen to them. Because this is what happens to religious people all the time. I'm an atheist because I'm strong and rational and thoughtful. You're about wish fulfillment. And therefore, religious people are by definition weaker, less sophisticated. We understand, you shouldn't be religious, but I understand you need it. There are people who believe in the afterlife who are weak and fearful, and people who believe in the afterlife who are courageous and strong. There are atheists who are weak and fearful. There are atheists who are courageous and strong. It is an unworthy argument to say that someone believes in something because of wish fulfillment as opposed to someone believes in something because it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. That's not the way you ought to argue about religion or anything else.
Bradley just said that his belief in an afterlife is predicated on the effect this belief has in his life. It gives him hope. He finds it immensely consoling.
Is that why you believe in the afterlife? I'm just curious.
No, but it is
Okay,
one of
just
the
wanted to
benefits
check.
of it.
Okay,
Right.
so
It has a consequence, but that doesn't mean that that's why. Look, I find it enormously consoling and wonderful to think that my daughter loves me. But I don't believe it because I find it enormously consoling. I believe it because she does.
okay.
She's a
You
teenager.
do, right? Okay, just a little empirical verification there.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain,
Right.
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces. You can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
David?
And I think a much more important point is, if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books is I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
And I'm sorry to say, David, that your shorthand account of our disagreement is a little
Self-serving?
a little deceptive. I mean, if you say to me of yourself that the fact that I hold a belief that makes me feel better has nothing to do with why I hold the belief, I might just believe it from you, I suppose. But Freud isn't as crude as you make him sound. He said that to ask people to accept that humanity's oldest fear, that of death, and oldest wish, that of the ability to survive it, has nothing to do with the faith in an afterlife. It's only a coincidence if it makes people feel better. I'm not going to accept that, and you shouldn't be putting it about either. Yeah.
David, you didn't get a chance to respond to the near-death. Does that have any impact on your beliefs?
I'll just say this about near-death experiences. First of all, I would love, I wouldn't like to have one, but I'd love to have one. And I've been operated on several times with the sad result of having nothing other than unconsciousness during the operation. But 8 million people have reported these near-death experiences, according to a Gallup poll in '92, so presumably others have had it since then. The sort of William James pragmatic test of whether an experience is real is that, in fact, many, many, many of them report that they no longer fear death, that their lives have radically changed as a result of it. And the only thing I would say is, do I say that this is proof that there's an afterlife? My answer is no, but. And here's the but.